This happened when I was taking a gap year to travel around Japan, and I happened to be in a place called Shinjuku in Tokyo. Shinjuku has a pretty famous red light district, and although I don't partake in that kind of thing, the rest of Shinjuku is a pretty amazing place to be, and I don't think this whole incident should reflect badly on it. Anyway, I was just hopping on my scooter outside a 7-Eleven when a young woman ran past me and into the store. I didn't get a good look at her, but the speed that she was moving definitely got my attention. Then, as I heard her start to scream at the guy behind the counter, even when she was behind the glass doors, I knew something awful was happening. I was so engrossed with the whole situation that I didn't ride off just yet. Call me a nosy Parker or whatever, but I wasn't about to just move on when something so exciting was going on. I say exciting, that's what it felt like at the time. I had no idea how much that poor girl was suffering, and even exactly what was happening to her. I was trying to peer into the shop to see what was happening and maybe work out why she was screaming so much, and I was so busy looking in that I didn't even see the 3 blokes who had walked up behind me, past me, and then entered the shop itself. They were all wearing suits, like pretty expensive looking suits too, and I didn't put 2 and 2 together until I saw them grab the screaming girl. The biggest guy just grabbed her from behind, like wrapped her arms around her body, while another just grabbed her legs, and as much as she was struggling, they just walked her out of the 7-Eleven like they were carrying a carpet. It was only when they carried her back past me that I saw what kind of state she was in. Her clothes were ripped, her face had dried blood around the nose and mouth, all stuff I missed when she bolted past me the first time. Then, just as I was about to say something to one of the guys, I don't know what exactly, just anything to let them know that what they were doing was horrible, one of them turned to me and gave me this death stare, and I saw he had this massive knife in his hand, kind of like a samurai sword type thing, but smaller. I have no idea what you call it, but I know a scary knife when I see one, so I kept my mouth shut as the guys bundled her into a car and sped off. I always felt so guilty that I didn't do anything more, but I also know the guy with the knife probably would have stabbed me if I'd have even laid a finger on him. I did call the police, and although there was a real language barrier at first, as my Japanese is terrible and the police didn't speak English, some random walking past offered their help in translating, as they were basically fluent in English. But get this, as soon as I mentioned the bit about the guys in the suit showing up and bundling the girl into a car, the officer taking notes literally just gave me this tired look and put his notepad away. They were suddenly just not all that interested in the crime anymore, and not long after some weak assurances that they go investigate, they just buggered off from their car. The kind stranger then explained that the guys in the suits were probably Yakuza, a kind of Japanese gangster, and that the girl was probably an escort from another country. The gang pretty much runs all of the red light district around Shinjuku, at least they apparently did when I was over there, and the police get reports like that all the time. Most of the girls are there illegally or are always in trouble with the police for various reasons, so sometimes the bad things that happen to them barely get investigated at all. Pretty scary if you ask me. Like, imagine being the girl and just knowing that no one was going to help you. I've been living in Japan for almost 10 years now, as I settled here after retiring from the military. I fell in love with Japanese culture, their food, and their people, but another big reason was that I met my wife here, and since she wasn't willing to move to the United States, I made the decision to settle here instead. Now, the story I have to tell you isn't strictly my story, it's hers, but I know for a fact that she wouldn't be happy on typing it out, nor is her English to the level that she'd be able to properly describe the whole thing. But I can assure you, I have her consent to tell the story, as it's almost as morbidly fascinating as it is horrifying. In early 2002, my wife was around 10 years old and she was living in a place called Kokorakitaku. One day, she saw her neighbor's car pull up outside his home, and it looked like he was kind of dragging a girl from the passenger seat and back inside the house. Not dragging like she was kicking and screaming, more like a scolded child who was in trouble with their parents or something. But it was still very distressing to see a man treat such a young girl like that. Japanese parenting can be extremely harsh, and girls like my wife were taught that the father is always right, no matter what. So although what she saw was very upsetting, she didn't think it was any of her business or whatever, so she didn't speak up about it. But then a few days later, she happened to see the exact same girl escaping from the house again. Only that time, she looked like she had been through torture. She absolutely bolted off down the street, hair a mess, half clothed, and it was only then that my wife knew something was seriously wrong. She mentioned the whole thing to her mom, trying to tell her that she thought something really bad was going on in that house. Turns out there was, and it's one of the evilest things I've ever heard in my whole life. Her neighbor turned out to be a guy named Futoshi Matsunaga, and I swear to God that man was the devil incarnate. He once blackmailed a guy into moving into his home, as the guy used to be a criminal who hadn't been caught for his crimes, and Futoshi said he'd go to the cops and snitch on him if he didn't do what he said. Once the guy had moved in, he basically tortured him to death with electric shocks. At one point, he made the guy eat his own feces, but he soon got bored of doing all that stuff himself, and then started getting the guy's own daughter to torture him too. I heard he made her bite her own father so hard it drew blood, and once he made the kid electrocute her own dad so much that his heart stopped, and he died. After that, he made the girl smash up her own dad's body with a hammer before tossing the remains into the sea. And after that, he kept the guy's daughter prisoner, basically with the same ploy of, do as I say, or I'll tell the cops what you've done. And the girl believed she'd go to prison too. I mean, he talked her into thinking she'd kill her own dad, which I suppose she had, so I get why she was so terrified of him. But anyway, Futoshi ends up meeting one of his murder victim's friends, takes a liking to her, and decides to make her his next victim. I have no idea how he did this, but he ended up either blackmailing or conning her out of tens of thousands of dollars. He then basically mentally and physically tortured the woman and her daughter for years, until the woman finally jumped out of the second floor of his house. Some think it was an attempt to take her own life, others say it was an outright escape attempt, but the end result was the woman being put in a mental institution. So, the whole time this is happening, Futoshi has an accomplice by the name of Junko. After the first two messed up things happened, Junko tried to escape. So, to get her to come back, Futoshi actually faked his own death by pretending to take his own life. I have zero clue how a person would go about doing that, maybe via a phone call or something so she couldn't actually see what he was doing, but it worked, as she ended up going back to the house where she was then taken prisoner again. Junko's family then came to try and rescue her, and somehow Futoshi held them captive too, and basically used them to bankroll all of his evil acts. From what I heard, after the family had a huge fight, Futoshi forced Junko to electrocute her own father to death, just like he'd done with his first victim. He then talked Junko's brother and sister into killing each other, and then locked one of them in a room where he starved them to death. Quick side note, I know this all sounds completely insane and far-fetched, but it is true. You can look it all up if you need to, and it's all there in media articles and everything. But obviously there aren't too many gruesome details, and basically no one but Futoshi knows really what happened, and I don't think he ever really talked about any of it. But anyway, Futoshi basically manipulated the whole family into actually killing each other, and then had them boil the remains away in giant pots before they threw them into the sea. The whole time this was going on, he was holding the first guy's daughter captive, and it was her who my wife saw escape that day. If you ask me, the girl who escaped is basically a hero, because if it wasn't for her survival instincts and her determination, the guy might have gone on killing for years. Even after he basically wiped out the family, he kept on conning people out of money and convincing their kids to come live with him. People say he used drugs or hypnosis to get people to kill each other, and I'm not sure if that's actually true, but I really can't imagine what could make a whole family turn on each other like that. So maybe it is true. I own and operate a farm here near Okuma, Japan. It was started by my grandfather, who passed it down to my father, who in turn passed it down to me. I had career plans and a job in the United States waiting for me, but when my father died at a fairly young age, I gave everything up to follow in his footsteps. It was his dying wish that, instead of just selling the farm off to another family or a large company, his own blood would continue to run it, so that we could still have our name attached to it. How could I say no to that? Well, I couldn't, so here I am. Not many of you will be familiar with the name Okuma, although maybe some of you are. I met some Americans who have an astonishing amount of knowledge concerning Japanese culture and geography, but it's a prefecture with a very famous name, and once I tell you it, you will start to understand why my story is so horrifying. The name of the prefecture I live in is Fukushima. It was the 11th of March 2011, a day I'll never, ever forget. It was the middle of the afternoon when we felt the ground begin to shake, and here in Japan, earthquakes are still frightening, but they are something we all sort of get used to after a while. Even the tsunami wasn't very bad for us, as we are far back from the coastline, on higher ground than the cities, so the water didn't reach us. We saw the destruction on television, and although I felt very bad for those affected, it would obviously not affect our farm very much. I remember hearing about the nuclear power plant and how some people living close to it had been evacuated, but the TV said it was merely a precaution at first. Only later did they admit that there had been meltdowns in the reactors and that the explosions had contaminated the air around it. At first, it was just a few thousand who needed to leave their homes, then it was 10,000, and before long, everyone within a 13-mile radius of the power plant had to leave their home in order not to be affected by the radiation, and that included me. When the men from the government showed up at my farm and told me to leave, I refused. I couldn't leave my horses, I just couldn't. Without me or my farm hands, they would starve to death, all 130 of them. The men told me that if I didn't leave, I would be at risk of developing cancer, or worse, I might be overcome by the radiation and die a very painful death. I told them that I would rather die the worst pain imaginable than dishonor my father by letting the farm die. And while the farm lives, part of my father and grandfather still live. If it died, their legacies would also do so. And so, you must understand, that is completely unacceptable to me. I couldn't leave the farm, and I did not develop cancer either, or yet, but staying at the farm was still incredibly painful for me. Of my 130 horses, I watched 90 of them die over the course of the next 5 years. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 a night. I would walk out into the morning to check on them and see their dead bodies just lying in the fields or in their stables. Slowly, it slowed down until only 1 a day, then once a month, until it was only the survivors left. I was told I could collect compensation for the deaths, but after so many, the authorities began to doubt that they were all radiation deaths. We had to start performing autopsies on the bodies to prove that they had lethal amounts of cesium in their skin and organs, and sometimes we were told it was not a lethal dose and they refused to pay us money. It was one thing to watch my beloved animals die over time, but then to be called a liar or a cheat by the same people who were so very sorry at first. This is the gravest insult imaginable to me. Some of my horses have been sent to live on other farms to keep them safe, and as the levels of radiation decrease over time, I'm slowly bringing them all home. Day by day, the farm is coming back to life, and I will never give up on it. If need be, I'll die here with it, and I'll be buried where my horses are buried, right along with them. In Japan, we call the survivors of the atomic bombs the hibakusha. But if you add another Chinese character, most of our letters are taken from Chinese, mind you, the word becomes one that means someone exposed to radiation. I know my suffering doesn't compare to those who suffered in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I would not pretend to have suffered the same as them. But sometimes, with the way we are treated by the rest of Japan, with the way my products are constantly tested for radiation even though I make sure that they're all safe to eat. Sometimes I too feel like I could be called a hibakusha. Back when I was vacationing in Japan with some friends of mine, a dude fell off a balcony, I think from being drunk. But instead of just straight up responding, emergency services spent 5 minutes on the phone asking me what my relation to the man was, who he was, and what he was doing, etc. I speak fluent Japanese, so communicating was no problem, but the big deal they made about his identity was just so frustrating. I kept saying I just ran into the man and didn't know any of these things. I explained that I didn't even see it happen. I just heard what sounded like a watermelon hitting pavement abruptly. I was hoping that they would get to ask me where I am and send someone. He was unconscious and bleeding from his head as I was on the phone basically doing a job interview. Then after the ambulance arrived, they asked me to get in the ambulance with this guy and even had him taking off his clothes while I was there. They spent 15 minutes in the parking lot asking me and him questions. He clearly had amnesia and didn't know anything, and I was still just as clueless as to what happened as I was on the phone. I hope he's okay, but honestly, they wasted so much valuable time trying to get pointless answers out of the guy instead of treating him. It made me scared that if anything bad happened to me, I might bleed out or drown or whatever, and they'd be asking some other person all these same dumb, redundant questions. Born on December 30th of 1984, Lindsay Ann Hawker was the daughter of Bill and Julia Hawker and was raised in the English city of Coventry. She attended the King Henry VIII School, then went on to study biology at the University of Leeds, graduating with a first-class honors degree in the summer of 2006. Initially, Lindsay had plans to pursue a master's degree in her chosen subject, but began to feel a deep wanderlust after watching friends take gap years to travel the world. To her delight, Lindsay discovered she could blend travel and academia when she came across an organization known as NOVA, a Tokyo-based conversational English school. She applied for a teaching position and was subsequently accepted, flying out to Japan in October of 2006 to commence her employment. Lindsay stayed in shared accommodation with 2 other foreign teachers and regularly used email, Skype, and telephone calls to maintain contact with her family. She also used an email to keep in touch with her English students, one of whom was named Tatsuya Ichihashi. Tatsuya was born on January 5th of 1979 and spent his formative years in both Gifu and Chiba prefectures in southern Japan. He came from a family of professionals, with his mother working as a dentist while his father was a widely respected medical doctor. Yet after graduating from Chiba University in 2005, Tatsuya failed to find work, and at the time he enrolled at the Nova English School, he was living on a parental monthly allowance of about 100,000 yen, which is equivalent to about $760. Although Tatsuya had no previous criminal convictions, he had once been accused of assaulting a man during an attempted robbery. However, before the matter reached a court of law, Tatsuya's parents essentially paid the man to drop the charges. Despite his penchant for antisocial behavior, Tatsuya had a long-term girlfriend and regularly worked on his physical fitness, once claiming to cycle around 25 kilometers a day, 6 days a week. Yet he also kept a large collection of extremely violent comic books and was said to pore over them for hours at a time on a nearly daily basis. Yet when Tatsuya learned that Lindsay was his online English teacher, he obtained her email address and began to communicate with her outside of professional hours. Nova's website included small biographies of their teachers, and this was how Tatsuya was able to find out what Lindsay looked like. A few days later, he happened to be present at the same train station that Lindsay used for her commute, and he approached her to initiate conversation. Once he established that she was indeed the same Lindsay Hawker who taught him English online, he walked her back to her shared accommodation, and it's then that Lindsay invited him inside for a glass of water before he made his own journey home. Once he was inside, Tatsuya apparently made a quick sketch of Lindsay, signing it with his name and phone number. This endeared Lindsay to him so much that she agreed to meet him for a private English lesson at a cafe 4 days later. It's not clear if this was a date or simply a professional courtesy, but what is clear is that this was arguably the biggest mistake of Lindsay's entire life. The pair met at the cafe on Saturday, March 24th of 2007, and for some reason, Lindsay agreed to briefly visit Tatsuya's apartment once the meeting was over. After catching a cab to the apartment, which was just a few hundred yards from the cafe, Lindsay asked the driver to wait outside for a few minutes, as she wasn't planning on staying very long. Around 10 to 15 minutes later, when she failed to emerge altogether, the taxi driver drove off, having assumed she'd changed her mind. Back in the UK, as the hours ticked by, Lindsay's parents noticed that she hadn't been in contact with them that day. Due to the huge time difference between England and Japan, it was common for their communications to be staggered, but Lindsay never failed to check in with them. Her parents then contacted Lindsay's boyfriend, who was also patiently awaiting her return to the United Kingdom, but he told them that he too hadn't heard from her at all that day and was starting to become very, very worried. When Lindsay's parents asked him if he had any reason to be particularly worried, he told them that she was meeting one of her students that day for coffee, and that she'd gone dark right around the same time this meeting was due to commence. By this point, Lindsay's parents were in full-on panic mode, as were her close friends, but their attempts to contact Japanese law enforcement were hindered by time zone differences and language barriers. It took until Monday, March 26th, for a substantial missing persons report to be filed by the staff of the Nova English School, who contacted the police in the middle of the afternoon. Police officers first visited her accommodation, but were told by her roommates that she hadn't returned following a meeting with one Tatsuya Ichihashi. The officers then drove over to Tatsuya's apartment, and although they didn't have the correct level of probable cause to break into his home, they stayed outside, observing for any suspicious behavior from the man himself, and eventually called for backup at around 7 p.m. that evening. 2 hours after the call for backup was made, 9 heavily armed police officers had assembled outside of Tatsuya's apartment. Yet, upon seeing them gathering outside of his home, Tatsuya made a run for it. The police spotted his escape attempt, chased him down, and cornered him in an alleyway not far from his apartment. Yet Tatsuya utilized his considerable athletic abilities to scale a nearby wall before absconding altogether. His attempt to flee constituted reasonable grounds for a search, and not long after he was detained, the cops broke into his apartment and began searching for signs of Lindsay. Upon making their way onto the apartment's balcony, police officers made a bone-chilling discovery. There sat a detached bathtub, one that had been filled with a mixture of compost soil and sand. They only paw through the surface layer of the dirt before uncovering evidence that a human corpse was concealed underneath. And after emptying the bathtub, the officers discovered that the body belonged to none other than Lindsay Hawker. She had been bound and gagged with plastic zip ties and a woolen scarf, and bruising across her upper body indicated that she had been subjected to a prolonged and brutal assault. Egg-sized swellings on her face indicated that she had been struck repeatedly with a closed fist, with lesser bruising on her arms and rib cage, suggesting that she had collided with furniture as she attempted to evade her attacker. It was evident that she had been killed via intense strangulation, as the cartilage in her neck was broken, and although it's not clear why, her killer had shaved her head with a straight razor following her death. After she had been killed, Tatsuya had soaked the mixture of compost and sand with a substance used to compact and decompose organic waste. And since multiple trips to a gardening supply store had been made over the course of several days, it became obvious that Tatsuya had been planning on killing her, or at least somebody, for quite a while. As a result of the investigation that followed, police determined that Tatsuya had dragged the bathtub onto his balcony following Lindsay's murder, as several of his neighbors said that they heard sounds of something striking metal and something being dragged during that time frame. Tatsuya was subsequently placed on the nationwide list of wanted criminals, and an intensive search commenced shortly afterwards. That same day, 20 armed police officers raided the Hotel Chateau, a brothel located just east of central Tokyo. Intelligence suggested that Tatsuya may have been laying low at the brothel, which also functioned as a kind of budget hotel, but unfortunately, he was nowhere to be found. Police then appealed the Japanese public, begging them for any and all information that may lead to his capture. They released updated images of him, detailing any potential disguises he might use to evade justice, one of which included what he might look like if he applied makeup and dressed in female clothing. They also released images of the sketches he'd made of Lindsay Hawker, in the hopes that someone might recognize the drawing style. But despite law enforcement's extensive search campaign, they were unable to locate the fugitive, Tatsuya. During the first few months of 2008, police gleaned intelligence that suggested that Tatsuya was hiding out in a place called Kabukicho, an area of Tokyo famous for its red light district. It was here that a number of escorts identified Tatsuya as having paid for their time at some point during the previous years. Some even stated that they believed him to be present in Kabukicho. Yet despite an intensive house-to-house search of the district, Tatsuya once again evaded capture. By October that year, officers began to suspect that the reason they couldn't find Tatsuya was that he had taken his own life, while others purported that he had fled the country and was taking refuge in the Philippines. Yet despite many losing hope of ever finding him alive, certain sections of the Japanese police refused to give up, and by the summer of 2009, the cash reward for information leading to Tatsuya's arrest was raised from 1 million to a whopping 10 million yen. Then in November of 2009, police announced they'd received a tip that Tatsuya had undergone plastic surgery at a clinic in Nagoya. Not only had he received a nose lift to obscure his identity, he had 2 moles on his cheek removed, had folds added to his eyelids, and had both lips thinned out. The knowledge that he was both still alive and still in Japan spurred police to close the capture net around him, and finally, in November of 2009, he was spotted in the southern city of Osaka. It was while trying to board a ferry to the island of Okinawa that Tatsuya was finally arrested. Upon his detention, he was charged with both murder and carnal violation, but refused to say a single word to investigators during questioning. It was only when threatened with the death penalty that he released a statement through one of his lawyers, and even then, he refused to accept full responsibility for Lindsay's death. Tatsuya claimed that he hadn't actually meant to kill her, and what occurred was a bedroom game that had gone horribly wrong. According to him, after Lindsay had passed out, he attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and it was only when it failed to revive her that he panicked and attempted to dispose of her corpse. It was only in court, probably in an attempt to avoid a death sentence, that Tatsuya admitted that he'd suffocated Lindsay in order to prevent her from screaming for help while he attacked her. In response, a district court sentenced Tatsuya to life imprisonment, and there seems very little chance that he'll ever be paroled. On the 2nd anniversary of Lindsay's murder, her father revisited the country to express his gratitude to the Japanese police force and all others who gave information or who aided in the judicial process. Years later, Tatsuya wrote an autobiographical account of his time on the run, which he called Until I Was Arrested. Its publication was extremely controversial, so to offset the outrage, he offered to pay every penny of the book's revenue to Lindsay's family, but they rejected the offer. In their eyes, Tatsuya had taken away the thing they valued most in the world, the life and love of their daughter, and nothing, especially not money, could ever heal the wounds they'd suffered. In the quaint, quiet suburbs of the Japanese city Sagamihara lies a place known in English as the Sukui Lily Garden. The Lily Garden is a residential care center for folks who are unable to look after themselves, and is situated within some outstandingly beautiful woodlands on the bank of the Sagami River. It's home to around 150 residents between the ages of 19 and 75, all of whom suffer from some kind of mental or physical disability. The more capable often engage in rudimentary forms of education and outdoor activity, while those that are bedridden are made as comfortable as possible by a team of dedicated doctors, nurses, and general care workers. One of these employees was named Satoshi Uematsu, and although he once enriched the lives of those under his care, his enduring legacy would be one of utter destruction. In July of 2016, Satoshi was a 26-year-old qualified in elementary education, and for more than 3 years, he was paid by the Lily Garden to provide the basic standard of education that I mentioned earlier. Yet in February of that same year, he suddenly resigned from the care facility after some had noted a dramatic shift in his personality. Neighbors have described him as being a friendly, outgoing, and good-natured man, who suddenly took on a dark and brooding persona that caused deep rifts in both his personal and professional relationships. Shortly after this bizarre personality shift, Satoshi handed in his resignation papers and broke off contact with almost all of his former coworkers. Around the same time that he quit his job, Satoshi visited the Tokyo home of a high-ranking politician named Tadamori Oshima. Although he was denied entry by Oshima's bodyguards, Satoshi returned the next day with a handwritten letter and implored the guards to hand it to their employer. According to one of them, Satoshi gave such an impassionate speech regarding the importance of the letter that one of them actually did hand it over to Oshima. Satoshi had claimed that he had an idea of what would improve the lives of every Japanese citizen, and how it might even make the entire world a more stable and more prosperous place to live. But when Mr. Oshima read the letter, he discovered that Satoshi's idea was anything but benevolent. Satoshi's letter outlined the need for and the benefits of one of the evilest ideas in human history: euthanasia. He begged Oshima to propose legalizing ending the lives of those with multiple disabilities, but only in cases where it was requested by their guardians. He knew that Oshima had the ear of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, with one passage reading, "I envision a world where a person with multiple disabilities can be euthanized, with an agreement from the guardians when it is difficult for the person to carry out household and social activities." Satoshi added that the murder of the disabled would not only be beneficial to Japan, but would also contribute towards overall world peace. In his mind, it would boost economics to the point of staving off the advent of the Third World War. All that was chilling enough, but what Mr. Oshima found particularly alarming was the fact that, towards the end of his letter, Satoshi volunteered to target 2 separate facilities responsible for housing the mentally and physically disabled. If Oshima would promise him legal immunity, he said that he could kill 460 people in the course of just one day. Satoshi then signed the letter off with not just his name, but also his address, telephone number, and the name of his former care home employees. Oshima immediately handed the letter over to a branch of the Tokyo police force, and in turn forwarded it to the police over in Sagamihara. But the process seems to have been painfully slow, and it took them far too long to catch up with an increasingly bloodthirsty Satoshi. In that time, the man himself had posted numerous tweets detailing how Japan was being ravaged by radiation and venereal diseases, how its natural and financial resources were being drained by those in no state to give back to society. Finally, when the police caught up with him, he was arrested, detained, questioned, and then involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital for 2 weeks. After those 2 weeks were up, a doctor assessed Satoshi and declared that he was no longer a threat to those around him. But his newfound sanity was nothing but an elaborate front, and he saw his freedom as a chance to finally reap the merciful destruction he'd always longed for. And so, he began to plan an attack on those he believed needed saving from unhappiness. Just after 2 a.m. on July 26th, Satoshi crept along the tree-lined bank of the Sagami River, eventually finding himself outside the facility he was formerly employed at, the Sukui Lily Garden Care Home. He silently scaled the side of the building, then used a small hammer to knock out a pane of glass from a first-floor window. It wasn't the violent, crashing, splintering sound you might expect either. He was subtle, arguably delicate about it, and The sound didn't alarm any nearby nurse so much as confuse her. She entered the room to investigate the source of the sound, only to find a waiting Satoshi armed with a long, sharpened kitchen knife. She begged him not to hurt her, and Satoshi assured her she'd be fine. All she had to do was stay quiet, let him tie her up, and give up her keys. And in her terrified state, she did so without a word. Satoshi now had access to almost every room in the entire care home, and while utilizing controlled aggression, as well as the element of surprise, he rendered each of the overnight employees defenseless and without recourse. Then one by one, he visited each of the care home's residents, and one by one, he plunged his knife into their necks. Bound employees later said that the terrified screams of the dying were something that'll haunt them for the rest of their lives. Most knew Satoshi as a kind and caring man, one who taught them almost everything they knew about the world. So when he appeared in their bedrooms in the dead of night, with a knife and a look of pure malice on his face, their fear must have been indescribable. Uematsu killed 10 women and 9 men that night, each aged between 18 and 70 years old. On top of that, he injured 26 others, inflicting life-threatening injuries on people that had grown to love him over the course of his teaching tenure. But it would have been many, many more if it wasn't for the courageous actions of some of the care staff, who broke free from their bonds and rushed in to inform emergency services. They made the call just before 2:30 a.m. and began screaming in Satoshi's direction that the police were on their way. Satoshi entered a frenzy of violence following the news, but he was unable to take revenge on the escaped workers thanks to them barricading themselves inside one of the wards. 20 minutes after the call, Satoshi fled the care home, just in time to avoid capture by the responding police units, who were greeted by nothing short of a bloodbath when they arrived. A total of 29 ambulances were sent to the facility, and this is mostly the reason why so many of the severely wounded had their lives saved. Satoshi, on the other hand, was actually not attempting to escape and had handed himself into a local police station. He'd also brought the murderer weapon along with him, as proof of the evil he'd wrought on those who'd once trusted him, even loved him. When news of the murders hit the headlines, the shock and horror of the Japanese public was palpable. The horror was even felt by those around the world, who wondered how such an act of evil was even possible. The Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary acknowledged that the attack was a heart-wrenching and shocking incident in which many innocent people became victims. He also said that the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare would investigate ways to prevent a similar attack from reoccurring. Several of Japan's major media outlets labeled the murders a hate crime against the disabled, and the fact that Satoshi was a vocal proponent of euthanasia stunned all who learned of it. Shockingly, by September of 2016, the case had generated a huge amount of controversy both in Japan and abroad. Very little information had been released about the victims of the attack, and some Japanese were quick to inform the wider world that this was due to Japanese culture and stigma, how they were considerably less accepting of the physically and cognitively impaired than their Western counterparts. In Britain and America, the victims would have been venerated, perhaps had a memorial erected to honor them. Yet in Japan, there was nothing of the sort, and some said even the families of the victims were reluctant to publicly identify themselves. On February 20th of the following year, after a thorough analysis by Japanese psychologists, Satoshi was legally declared sane to stand trial for the 19 murders he'd committed. On top of that, he was also charged with 24 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of illegal confinement causing injury, and 1 count of violating the Swords and Firearms Control Law. A few months later, Satoshi defied the wishes of his defense counsel, saying that denying the charges against him would be quibbling and would make the trial too complex. Even in light of his guilty plea, the prosecution announced that the death penalty was officially being sought against Satoshi on account that his rampage was inhumane and left no room for leniency. Finally, on March 16th of 2020, Satoshi was sentenced to die by the Yokohama District Court, and just 2 weeks later, his death sentence was finalized after he withdrew his chance of an automatic appeal. In order for the local community to move on from the painful memories of the massacre, the owners of the Sukui Lily Garden ordered the main residential facility to be demolished. However, the facility has since been rebuilt and was opened in July of 2021, complete with a memorial to those that lost their lives. The memorial represents a shift in Japanese culture, which has since made an effort to further recognize the struggles of those with mental and physical disabilities. The mother of one of the victims, a 19-year-old girl named Miho, told a national news outlet, "I hope the victims will continue to live in someone's heart. I want people to remember Miho. It's hard and discrimination has caused a lot of sad cases, but I find that when I write Miho's name on the monument, it keeps her alive inside my heart." Born September 28th of 1982, Tomohiro Kato was raised in the suburbs of Aomori, a large city on the northern coast of Japan's largest home island. His father was a high-ranking executive in a large financial corporation, and like many Japanese fathers, he demanded a lot from his firstborn son. In light of this, Tomohiro didn't disappoint, and not only did he achieve immaculate grades throughout his education, he was also one of his school's top track athletes. In high school, he became president of the tennis club and continued his run of academic excellence well into his late teens. However, during his final exams, his grades plummeted dramatically and he failed the entrance examinations of the prestigious Hokkaido University. So instead of following in his father's footsteps, he enrolled at the Nako Nihon Automotive College, where he studied to be an auto mechanic. Upon graduation, he was hired as a temporary worker at an auto parts factory, and once this employment was terminated, he became restless, directionless, and violent. It was around this time that Tomohiro's relationship with his parents began to reach a breaking point. Both had put immense pressure on him to return to school to properly complete his final year examinations, but Tomohiro refused, and in an incident which would scar him for much of his adult life, he was once made to eat scraps of food from the dining room floor. His parents apparently told him it would make good practice for when he was homeless, and understandably, Tomohiro developed a deep resentment for them. A neighbor of the Kato family once recounted an incident in which Tomohiro's parents forced him to stand outside for hours in deep, cold snow during winter. So, it'll come as no surprise that by the time social media became popular, Tomohiro dedicated a lot of posts to putting his parents on blast for the way they mistreated him. By 2006, Tomohiro had been all but cut off by his parents and was deeply in debt to several major credit card companies. Having fallen into a deep depression, he attempted to take his own life by crashing his car into a solid concrete wall, but was unsuccessful in the attempt. In the 2 years that followed, Tomohiro sank into a deep pit of depression and anger, culminating in a huge outburst at his workplace on June 5th of 2008. When Tomohiro seemed to have misplaced some of his uniform, he accused his coworkers of having hidden it. They told him he was crazy, and in response, Tomohiro violently attacked them. Security had to intervene, and anticipating being fired for the indiscretion, he immediately announced that he was quitting. Over the next 2 days, Tomohiro posted a series of messages onto a website known as Extreme Exchange Revised. One section read, "If only I had a girlfriend, I wouldn't have quit work. I would never have become addicted to my mobile phone. Anybody with hope couldn't possibly understand how I feel. I don't have a single friend, and I won't in the future. I'll be ignored because I'm ugly. I'm lower than trash because at least the trash gets recycled." The message also referred to a stabbing spree that he was planning on committing, but Tomohiro often spoke of having violent fantasies, none of which have ever been fulfilled. However, it seems that around the same time this message was posted, something seemed to push him over the edge of reason. Some later suggested that other users on the website began insulting him, pointing out that he often threatened violence without ever following through with them. They may have called him a coward or a fake, in which case, Tomohiro set out to prove them wrong. The following day, just after noon, Tomohiro posted another message to the same website claiming, "I will kill people in Akihabara." These were once again dismissed as nothing but empty words, but his detractors couldn't have been more wrong. Tomohiro had rented a 5-ton Isuzu Elf truck from a local rental company and was waiting for a pair of busy streets to be closed off to traffic. The barriers weren't physical ones, and there was nothing actually stopping anyone from driving into the area. But traditionally, these areas were closed to vehicles during Sunday lunchtimes for the convenience of shopping pedestrians. The only thing really stopping anyone were the hordes of foot-mobile citizens, but that wasn't about to stop Tomohiro, as he was about to make good on his promises of murder. At exactly 12:33 p.m., Tomohiro slammed his foot on the truck's accelerator and sent the truck hurtling through the crowds. He almost immediately slammed into 5 different people after running a red light, and as those around them ran to their aid, Tomohiro jumped out of the truck, let out a horrifying war cry, then began stabbing them with a large knife. At least 12 people received stab wounds that day, and Tomohiro would have continued the attack if it wasn't for the swift intervention of local police officers. They chased Tomohiro down a narrow alleyway, guns drawn, until he finally dropped his knife and surrendered just 2 minutes after the attack commenced. Tomohiro was arrested and held for almost 2 weeks while being subjected to numerous psychiatric tests. He told police that he'd been planning on killing people for a long time, and despite deleting all of his online threats in the moments before the attack, he gave law enforcement an in-depth account of all the things he'd written, claiming they were all cries for help, posted publicly in the hopes that someone would stop him. He'd purchased the knife at a military supply shop just 2 days prior and had even sold his personal computer to raise money to rent the truck. This led some to speculate that Tomohiro never intended on surviving the attacks, and that he was hoping that his life would be taken by the police. Where he changed his mind was when he actually was faced with death. The attack made global headlines, as well as horrifying the Japanese public. Aomori had long been considered an incredibly safe city to live in, with no such mass casualty event having occurred there before. In response, the Japanese government claimed it would launch a lengthy review of the laws which regulated knife ownership, while the Tokyo Metropolitan Public Safety Commission announced that the 35-year-old practice of closing busy streets on Sundays and holidays was to be suspended until safety measures could be put into place. In order to sate the public's desire for swift justice, the Japanese government fast-tracked the execution of a famous serial killer who was executed by hanging on June 17th. The massacre also sparked intense debate on internet censorship when it was discovered that 2 Ustream users had broadcast live video streams of the tragedy, both of which had attracted an estimated 3,000 viewers. Both users were then suspected of being complicit in the attack and had to fight hard to clear their names of any suspicion. In the media frenzy that followed, a number of Japanese journalists labeled the attack as a symptom of a growing epidemic of kieru, a name given to acts of rage committed by Tokyo's alienated youth. Given that the stabbings occurred exactly 7 years after the Osaka school massacre, where 8 elementary school students were killed by a crazed criminal, some believe the 2 incidents might well have been connected. Prime Minister Fukuda Yasuo, who visited the site a week after the massacre, offered a tender prayer to those that had lost their lives. He added that he was worried that similar cases occur about 10 times a year in Japan, and cited statistics from the National Police Agency, which stated that 67 similar random attacks have taken place between 1998 and 2007. In the week that followed the attack, police claimed to have arrested several people who were intending to commit copycat killings elsewhere in Japan. Yet one seemed to have slipped through the net, as on June 22nd, 3 women were slashed by a 38-year-old woman at Osaka Station. By the end of the year, between 8 and 23 people had been arrested and 5 people warned for making threatening messages, all of whom were between the ages of 13 and 30. As a result, the Japanese public developed a terrifying obsession with seemingly random knife attackers and began asking themselves what exactly would cause such a frightening phenomenon. In 2010, Tomohiro's father issued an apology to the victims in a live television interview, announcing that he had resigned from his job and was living in seclusion in Aomori. His mother, on the other hand, had been hospitalized for mental health reasons, apparently all stemming from the shame of her son's actions. Then, in April of 2014, Tomohiro's 28-year-old brother took his own life, having previously indicated that he was unable to live with the deep shame that resulted from the massacre. It was clear that the victims of Tomohiro's attack weren't just confined to those he actually killed. In the process, he had torn apart his own family. Finally, on March 24th of 2011, Tomohiro was sentenced to death by the Tokyo District Court after it found him fully responsible for the attack. Tomohiro has since confessed to deep feelings of remorse over the massacre, stating that he would like to apologize to those that passed away, the injured, and their families. However, he also stated that he had no memory of some parts of the incident, and it's unclear whether this was to diminish his own responsibility or a natural trauma response at having committed such an obscene act of violence. But regardless, Tomohiro is doomed to die for his actions, and he is currently on Japan's version of death row, awaiting his inevitable execution. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, consider your socks buttered.